never before have the lives of so many changed so much, so quickly, as when the engines came to life for the very first time, with a roar that echoed over continents. In the soot and ash covering the streets, the people planted seeds of revolution. Visionaries of commerce and diplomacy electrified the world, and sparks of inspiration flew towards the sky. Up over the smokestacks rose a promise of a grand tomorrow.
Should you get hyped over Victoria 3? That's the essence of this video, and that is the question that I am going to attempt to answer for you with all of the information that I personally have. Now, I will say a lot of this video is me reading from a script, so while I do have Facecam on, unlike right now, I'm generally not going to be looking into the camera, so apologies for that. I'm new to Facecam. But anyway, on with the video. Firstly, we should know that the game is being helmed by Martin Wiz Anward, who was previously the game designer on Stellaris before leaving in 2018 to make Vicky 3. That means we have a pretty good idea about the amount of time that this game has been in development, 3 years, which certainly bodes well. The game, however, is not ready yet, and we do not have a release date announcement. Here, we should take a look to Paradox's two most recent titles. Imperator Rome was announced in May 2018 and released in April 2019, and CK3 was announced in October 2019, with the game released in September 2020. 11 months for both of them, and if we expect this standard timescale going forward, we can perhaps expect to get our sweaty little paws on Victoria 3 sometime in April 2022. So, what do we know about the game so far? Quite a bit, actually. There have been a couple of panels on Victoria 3 so far during PDXCon, and a hefty Reddit post written by my podcast co-host Liana Hafer, who has given a 1-hour presentation on the game for her work at IGN. But I think the best place to start, of course, is with what exactly is Victoria 3, and that is answered quite nicely in the first developer diary. It is a proper Victoria game, namely with a core focus on the economy, politics and internal country management, with the iconic Victoria pop system not just included as a core mechanic but made even deeper than in either of its predecessors. Though Victoria 3 is its own game and not an iteration on Victoria 2, our ambition is to create a worthy successor that stays true to the core values of the Victoria series while using what we've learned over the past decade in terms of making games more accessible, so that we can use that accessibility to build an even deeper game for old and new players alike. Our vision for Victoria 3 is to create what we call a society sim, a game that is first and foremost about the internal workings of the 19th century country that you are playing and how its society is shaped over the course of the game. Politics, economy and diplomacy are the three most important parts of the game. Wars are of course a part of the game, just as they were a part of the Victorian Age, but Victoria 3 is not a war game or a game about map painting.
One of the aims we had going into this game is that we didn't want war to be the main source of enjoyment, the main source of strategic and tactical decisions. War should not be driving the gameplay. This is not a map painter. So one thing we set out to do is that you should be able to play the entire 100-year campaign, never get into armed conflict, and still have a grand old time.
I don't know about you, but I find the idea of a Paradox game where warfare is not the primary driver of gameplay incredibly exciting. Paradox does map painting very well, perhaps too well, at the detriment of other kinds of play, and if they manage to pull off this game where Victoria 3 is an engaging experience without warfare as the primary motivation, then I truly think they could be onto a winner. Now, one thing that Paradox does for its new games is have design pillars.
Game pillars, or design pillars, is something we use for pretty much any game we make at PDS, Paradox Development Studio, that is. Game pillars forms the very much core vision and are often developed very early during concepting. You set down what is the game supposed to be? What are supposed to be the central themes for it? And what is it supposed to be, and more importantly, not to be? And then when you actually build a game and you design all the features and whatnot, you constantly refer back to the design pillars and you look, we have this cool idea, but does this follow the design pillars? Because you don't just want to throw every cool idea you have into the game. You have to consider what game you're trying to build and whether those ideas will work together.
Yes, of course.
So, for example, with Crusader Kings 3, these were like character focus, player freedom and progression, player stories, and approachability. Victoria 3 is no different in this regard, and its pillars are equally vague and intriguing. So we have national gardening. Building, shaping, tweaking, and evolving your nation is first and foremost focus of the game. Events outside your country's borders can naturally affect your country in significant ways, but the game should never rely on war to provide the main source of enjoyment. We have diplomatic eminence. War is a continuation of diplomacy, and everything that is achievable by war should also be achievable through diplomacy, even if that diplomacy sometimes comes at the point of a gun. Everything is political. Politics is at the heart of Victoria 3, and all major features should in some way tie back into the pops and interest groups that form the core of the game's politics. And it is an era of change. The Victorian era was a time of immense change politically, technologically, culturally, militarily, and socially, and these changes should be reflected in the experience of playing a campaign of Victoria 3. That all sounds suitably exciting, and personally, as someone who is very much a fan of POPs and POP-based systems in my grand strategy games, the fact that Victoria 3 will model all 1 billion people on the planet is a huge draw for me. Every last person, be they a wealthy capitalist, a factory worker, a child just entering the workforce, or even a slave, will be modelled, with each having their own needs and interests. Now, I have a couple of things to share, both from the aforementioned Reddit post by Leana, and also some video snippets from BDXCon that I think are really quite interesting and important. So, the campaign will go from 1836, the year before Queen Victoria's coronation, to 1936, and while 100 years will feel short if one compares it to other Paradox titles, the days are in fact split up into 4 ticks: morning, afternoon, evening, and night, meaning that your time with the game will be roughly comparable to EU4 and CK3. The smallest parcel of land on the map is called a province, but for the purposes of diplomacy, the smallest area you will interact with is called the state. A province can, however, be broken away from a state through diplomatic actions like demanding a treaty port. Urbanization, or the idea that cities will visually grow on the map as more people live there, can spread over province boundaries, something we have not seen in any previous Paradox title. Not every country will be playable from the start. This is because some nations in Africa, for example, would not be done justice with the existing style of gameplay, and the hope is to open up these nations in a future expansion. As with previous Paradox titles, there is such a thing as primary religion and culture for your nation, but interestingly, there is no such thing as culture groups. Instead, cultures will have traits like heritage and linguistics, and relations between cultures will look at these traits before deciding how discriminated against a culture would be in your nation. So, for example, an Englishman would not face too much discrimination should he migrate to the USA, but someone from France would face a little more, as their linguistic trait would be a barrier in that regard, while someone from Africa or Asia would face much more discrimination. Personally, I find this to be absolutely fascinating, and it truly puts to bed the idea that Paradox would shy away from the less romanticized parts of history. Not only have they accepted that some nations had really rather racist laws, they have in fact turned it into a game mechanic, as the laws within your country would determine just how discriminated against someone from a different culture and background would be.
We want to simulate all of history, not just the parts that are, so to speak, non-controversial. This is a socio-economic political 19th century simulator. It's of course extremely steep in all the politics and controversial subjects, and both more and less good things of the era. And we don't want to shy away from having any of that. We want to try and show it as it was, and where there are subjects that are controversial, we want to show the human cost of those subjects, because we actually have the ability to do that, because as I've said a few times, we do model the entire world's population, and that also means that we can show what impact things like colonialism or slavery had on the people of the era.
The Victoria 2 mechanic of spheres has been replaced with markets, and instead of there being a single world market, there will be many smaller ones. These markets are not static either, with the market leader being able to spend influence on having a larger market with more nations in it, or kick out other nations from their market. Trade can be done between markets with the import and export trade deals, which will be limited. POPs can belong to interest groups, such as industrialists, landowners, intelligentsia, etc., and all will have their own set of ideologies and traits, and will be led by a leader that has their own portrait and traits. One can invite interest groups into your government. The ones that are not invited will be members of your opposition. Every interest group has a certain amount of clout, which will affect their political weight when you wish to change laws. Now, one of the big things when it comes to external diplomacy that is different from Vicky 2 is diplomatic plays. These are somewhat similar to the crisis system from Vicky 2, but expanded and involved to be quite a bit more interesting. As we heard before, whatever you can achieve through warfare should be possible through diplomacy, and this is what is meant by that. One can conquer a state, annex, liberate and transfer subjects, take on colonies, make puppets, and more. One would start a diplomatic play with one of these goals in mind, and the opposing side can do the same. For example, as Prussia, one would want to take Schleswig-Holstein from Denmark, and as such would start a diplomatic play to transfer subject. Denmark would counter by demanding that Prussia release Pomerania and pay reparations. During the maneuver phase, one can sway other nations to your cause by offering them concessions. Like in our example, Prussia can offer the UK to take Danish Togo in the event that this diplomatic play leads to war. It does not have to lead to war, however, as Denmark could see the odds are stacked against them and back down, ceding over their subject. However, they could also look to other nations for aid, offering Prussia's rival Austria Prussian Silesia in the event of war. If one backs down during this phase, the only thing that they lose is the initial war goal. So if Denmark backs down, they just lose their subject, and not their colony of Togo, and if Prussia backs down, they lose Pomerania, but not Silesia. There is so much more too, and I will leave a link in the description to the info dump that Leanna has posted to Reddit and encourage you to read it and get hyped right alongside me. Now, my closing thoughts. What do I think of what we have seen so far for Victoria 3? Well, I am incredibly hyped, and I'll be following the progress of this game like a man with a telescope leaning out the side of a gilded zeppelin. If you are interested in following on with the progress of this game too, please sub and hit the bell button and all of that YouTube jazz, as there will be plenty of Victoria 3 videos to come on the channel. Until then, thank you so much for watching, get hyped, and I'll see you later. Bye bye.